Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of southeastern Oklahoma. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1879, a remote settlement along the Arkansas River in Flore County became the center of events that would challenge rational explanation and leave a permanent scar on the collective memory of those who survived to speak of it. The region of Flore County, in what was then Indian Territory, presents a landscape of extraordinary natural beauty and profound isolation. The Ouachita Mountains dominate the southern portions of the county, their densely forested ridges rising to elevations exceeding 2,000 feet. These mountains, formed over 300 million years ago during the Paleozoic era, stretch in parallel ridges running east to west for more than 200 miles. The Arkansas River forms the northern boundary of the county, its muddy waters providing the only reliable transportation route through this wilderness. In 1879, the nearest substantial settlement was Fort Smith, Arkansas, located approximately 30 miles to the east across the territorial border. The climate of the region is characterized by heavy precipitation, with annual rainfall often exceeding 50 inches. Dense forests of oak and pine cover the mountainsides, creating an environment of perpetual shadow in the valleys and hollows. In the spring months, when the events documented here began, morning mists would settle in the lowlands and remain until midday, lending the landscape an ethereal, otherworldly quality. The isolation of this region in 1879 cannot be overstated. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, suitable only for oxen and horses. Communication with the outside world required a journey of multiple days through treacherous terrain. The Choctaw Nation had controlled this territory since their forced removal from ancestral lands in Mississippi and Alabama during the 1830s. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 and subsequent removals had brought thousands of Choctaw people to Indian Territory, where they established farms, towns, and a functioning government. By 1879, Choctaw settlements were scattered throughout Flore County, though the population remained sparse. The town of Scullyville, approximately 15 miles west of Fort Smith, served as a major administrative center where federal annuity payments were distributed and where the Butterfield Overland Mail had maintained a station until the Civil War. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that the location at the center of these events was not unknown to the Choctaw people, who had lived in the region for nearly 50 years. 7 miles north of what would later become the town of Spiro, along a bend in the Arkansas River, a series of earthen mounds rose from the bottomlands. These structures, some reaching heights of over 30 feet, were clearly the work of human hands, though no living person could remember their construction. The Choctaw referred to the site with a word in their language that translates roughly as the place of the old people, or where the ancestors sleep. More troubling still was their consistent warning to avoid disturbing the mounds, particularly the largest structure, which stood apart from the others near the riverbank. According to the memoirs of Thomas Worthington Harlan, a surveyor employed by the federal government to map portions of Indian Territory, the mounds had long been a subject of speculation among the few white settlers and government officials who passed through the region. Harlan's journal preserved in the archives of the Oklahoma Historical Society, contains an entry dated March 12, 1879, in which he describes his first view of the site. He wrote that the mounds appeared as artificial hills of considerable regularity, covered in ancient trees whose roots have no doubt penetrated deep into whatever chambers or passages lie beneath. The Choctaw with whom I spoke refuse absolutely to approach within 200 yards of the largest mound, which they claim contains the remains of chiefs or priests who practiced dark rituals in times before memory. Into this isolated landscape in the autumn of 1878 came the Heidecker family. Emil Heidecker, a German immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1867, had spent the previous decade working as a mineralogist and amateur archaeologist in various locations throughout the Western Territories. Born in Bavaria in 1838, Heidecker had received education at the University of Heidelberg, where he studied natural philosophy and ancient history before immigrating to America at the age of 29. His wife, Margaret, was also of German extraction, born in Pennsylvania in 1843 to immigrant parents. The couple had 4 children: Friedrich, age 16 in 1879, Anna, age 14, Wilhelm, age 11, and the youngest, Clara, who had just turned 8. Emil Heidecker's interest in the Spiro mounds appears to have been ignited by his reading of early accounts of similar structures in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. In correspondence preserved by his brother-in-law in Pennsylvania, Heidecker expressed his belief that the mounds of Indian Territory might contain artifacts and remains of a civilization far older and more sophisticated than commonly believed. In a letter dated October 4, 1898, he wrote, "The scientific community has barely begun to understand the true nature of the ancient peoples who constructed these monuments. I am convinced that systematic excavation will reveal knowledge that challenges our understanding of history itself." The family established themselves on a claim approximately 1 mile from the largest of the Spiro mounds in November of 1878. According to land records maintained by the Choctaw Nation and later transferred to the Oklahoma Historical Society, Heidecker had secured permission to occupy this land through an arrangement with a Choctaw family, the Walkers, who held allotment rights to the area but resided primarily near Scullyville. The exact nature of this arrangement remains unclear, though subsequent testimony suggests that Heidecker paid a modest annual fee for the right to farm the bottomland near the river. The Heidecker cabin was a substantial structure by frontier standards, measuring approximately 30 by 20 feet, constructed of logs chinked with clay. Emil Heidecker had brought with him an extensive personal library, unusual for a settler in such a remote location. An inventory conducted later by territorial authorities listed over 200 volumes, including works on archaeology, geology, ancient history, and linguistics. Of particular note were several books concerning the mound-building cultures of North America, as well as texts on pre-Columbian civilizations of Mexico and Central America. During the winter of 1878 and into the spring of 1879, the Heidecker family appeared to integrate normally into the sparse community of settlers and Choctaw families in the region. Friedrich and Anna occasionally traveled to Scullyville for supplies, making the 2-day journey on horseback. These trips brought them into contact with other settlers, and accounts from this period describe the family as reserved but unremarkable. A merchant named Joseph Blackwood, who operated a trading post in Scullyville, later testified that Friedrich Heidecker seemed an intelligent and well-spoken young man, though he noticed that the boy seemed troubled when asked about his father's work. What Blackwood could not have known was that Emil Heidecker had begun excavating the largest mound in February of 1879, shortly after the ground had thawed sufficiently to permit digging. Documentation of this excavation comes primarily from Heidecker's own journal, which was discovered much later under circumstances that will be described in due course. The journal entries from February and early March detail a systematic approach to uncovering what Heidecker believed to be the entrance to a burial chamber. He wrote on February 18, 1879, "I have selected a location on the eastern face of the primary mound where the earth appears to have settled, suggesting an internal cavity." The Choctaw continue to warn against this endeavor, speaking of curses and spirits. Such superstition, while perhaps culturally significant, cannot deter scientific inquiry. The excavation initially proceeded without incident. Heidecker employed his two eldest sons in the work, digging a trench approximately 4 feet wide into the side of the mound. His journal describes layers of soil interspersed with ash and what he identified as ceremonial offerings, broken pottery, shell beads, and fragments of worked copper. By early March, the trench had penetrated approximately 15 feet into the mound when the diggers encountered what Heidecker described as a wall of logs, preserved by the particular chemistry of the soil, arranged in a manner suggesting a deliberate structure rather than random deposition. On March 22, 1879, according to the journal, the excavation broke through into a chamber. Heidecker's entry for that date conveys his excitement. "We have succeeded in breaching the outer wall of the burial chamber. The cavity beyond appears to extend deep into the heart of the mound. The air that emerged carried a peculiar odor, neither pleasant nor precisely foul, but suggestive of immense age. Tomorrow we shall enter and document whatever remains and artifacts lie within." The following day, Emil Heidecker, accompanied by his eldest son Friedrich, entered the chamber with lanterns and basic surveying equipment. What they found there is described in meticulous detail over several pages of the journal. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, with a ceiling supported by massive cedar logs. Along the walls were arranged the remains of numerous individuals, positioned in seated postures and adorned with elaborate ornamentation. Heidecker counted 17 distinct sets of remains, all showing evidence of deliberate preservation. More troubling still was his description of the artifacts surrounding these remains. Among the objects Heidecker catalogued were hundreds of shell beads, carved pipes of unusual design, ceremonial axes, and numerous items fashioned from copper and sheet mica. But what captured his attention most intensely were a series of tablets or plaques roughly 6 inches by 4 inches, inscribed with symbols that Heidecker found unlike any he had encountered in his studies. He wrote, "The glyphs or characters bear superficial resemblance to no known writing system of the indigenous peoples. The precision of their execution suggests a developed tradition of record-keeping. I have made careful drawings of several tablets and plan to remove them for more thorough examination." Here the rational observer must pause to consider the historical context and the limitations of knowledge available in 1809. The Spiro mounds would not be systematically excavated by trained archaeologists until the 1930s, and even then, under circumstances of deplorable commercial looting. Modern archaeology has established that the site was indeed a major ceremonial center of the Mississippian culture, flourishing between 800 and 1450 CE. The burial practices and artistic traditions of this culture were complex and sophisticated. However, Emil Heidecker, working alone and with the limited scholarly resources available in the 1870s, could not have possessed this understanding. What he did possess was sufficient knowledge to recognize that he had discovered something of profound significance. Over the following 3 weeks, Heidecker made repeated entries into the burial chamber, removing numerous artifacts and attempting to document the layout and contents of the space. His wife, Margaret, expressed growing concern about the excavation, concerns that appear in the journal in the form of arguments Heidecker felt compelled to record and refute. On April 8, 1879, he wrote, "Margaret has become unreasonably agitated about my work. She claims the children have been disturbed by dreams and that she herself feels watched when near the mound. I have attempted to explain that such feelings are products of imagination and superstition, exacerbated by the isolated nature of our situation and the natural human tendency to fear the unknown." The first documented indication that something had gone seriously wrong comes from the testimony of Samuel Whitfield, a Choctaw farmer whose land lay approximately 3 miles north of the Heidecker property. Whitfield's account, recorded by a territorial marshal on May 15, 1879, describes an encounter with Friedrich Heidecker on April 14th of that year. Whitfield stated, "I was riding along the river trail when I came upon the Heidecker boy. He was standing beside the path, staring toward the mound. When I greeted him, he turned to look at me, and I must say his appearance gave me considerable alarm. His face was deathly pale, his eyes seemed to have sunken back in his head, and he appeared to have lost considerable weight since I had seen him perhaps 2 weeks prior. When I asked if he was well, he said, 'We found them awake.' I asked what he meant, and he replied, 'The ones who were sleeping. Father said they were dead, but they were only sleeping, and now they're awake.'" Whitfield reported this encounter to the territorial authorities in Fort Smith when he traveled there for supplies later that month, but his statement was not initially investigated. Remote settlements frequently produced rumors and exaggerated tales, and Whitfield's account might have been dismissed entirely had subsequent events not compelled a more thorough examination. The next documented contact with the Heidecker family came on April 28, 1879, when Reverend Marcus Thornhill, a Methodist circuit preacher who traveled through the region conducting services for isolated settler families, arrived at the Heidecker cabin. Reverend Thornhill's account of this visit, written in a letter to his supervising bishop dated May 3, 1879, provides crucial testimony to the family's condition. The letter is preserved in the archives of the United Methodist Church and has been examined by numerous historians investigating the case. Thornhill wrote that he arrived at the cabin in mid-afternoon and found Margaret Heidecker in a state of extreme distress. The interior of the cabin was in disarray, with what Thornhill described as objects of evident antiquity scattered about the main room, many inscribed with heathen symbols of disturbing character. Margaret initially refused to allow him inside, speaking to him through the partially opened door. When Thornhill insisted, citing his concern for her welfare, she finally admitted him but urged him to speak quietly, saying that her husband was asleep and must not be disturbed, as he had been working through the nights and only rested during daylight hours. More troubling still was Thornhill's observation of the children. Anna and Clara were present in the cabin, but both appeared listless and unresponsive to his greetings. Thornhill noted that Anna, whom he had met on a previous visit in February, seemed to have aged considerably in the intervening 2 months. When he asked about Friedrich and Wilhelm, Margareta became agitated and said only that they were assisting their father with his work. Thornhill attempted to conduct a brief service, but found his efforts met with blank stares from the children and obvious discomfort from Margaret. Perhaps most disturbing was Thornhill's account of the artifacts he observed in the cabin. He wrote, "Among the relics spread across the table and floor were tablets of stone or fired clay bearing inscriptions of such peculiar character that I felt a distinct unease in their presence." Mrs. Heidecker noticed my attention to these objects and said, "He reads them now. He understands what they say." When I asked what her husband had learned from these tablets, she replied, "Things that should remain buried. The old people knew things that we have forgotten, things about what lies beneath the earth and what can be called up from those places." I attempted to counsel her against superstitious thinking, but she would hear none of it. Reverend Thornhill departed the Heidecker property deeply troubled and with the intention of returning within a fortnight to check on the family's welfare. However, circumstances prevented this return visit, and by the time other authorities became involved, it was already too late. During the first 2 weeks of May 1879, several Choctaw families who lived within a 5-mile radius of the Heidecker property reported disturbing occurrences. Samuel Whitfield reported hearing what he described as drumming emanating from the direction of the mounds during the night hours. He stated, "It was not like any drum I have heard before, not the drums used in our dances or ceremonies. The sound was deeper, slower, with long silences between beats. It would begin around midnight and continue until just before dawn." Other families reported similar phenomena. James Pitchlin, whose farm lay 4 miles southwest of the mounds, told territorial authorities that his livestock had become agitated during this period. His horses refused to be led past a certain point on the trail that led toward the river, and 3 of his cattle broke through a fence to move away from that direction. More significantly, Pitchlin reported seeing lights moving around the largest mound during the night of May 7th. He described these lights as torches or lanterns carried by several figures who appeared to be engaged in some kind of procession around the base of the mound. On May 11, 1879, Joseph Blackwood, the merchant from Scullyville, led a small group of settlers to the Heidecker property out of concern for the family's welfare. No member of the Heidecker family had been seen in Scullyville for over a month, and Reverend Thornhill's disturbing account had circulated among the small settler community. The group included Blackwood, a farmer named Henry Patterson, and Deputy Marshal Thomas Wade, who happened to be in Scullyville investigating an unrelated matter. The party arrived at the Heidecker cabin in the early afternoon of May 11th. They found the property eerily quiet. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, moving in the spring breeze. Deputy Marshal Wade's official report, filed with the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Smith on May 18, 1879, provides the most detailed account of what they discovered. Wade wrote, "We called out to announce our presence, but received no response. Upon entering the cabin, We found the interior in a state that suggested both habitation and profound disorder. Food had been left partially prepared on the table, suggesting interrupted activity. More disturbing were the numerous artifacts spread throughout the room, many of significant antiquity and apparent value. The cabin was empty. No members of the Heidecker family were present. Wade's report continues. We conducted a search of the immediate area and discovered a well-worn path leading from the cabin toward the large earthen mound approximately 1 mile distant. Following this path, we approached the mound and observed that extensive excavation had been conducted on its eastern face. A tunnel or trench, shored up with timbers, led into the interior of the structure. What the search party found in and around the mound would become the subject of intense debate and investigation for decades to come. Deputy Marshal Wade's official report provides only the most basic facts, perhaps because what he observed challenged his ability to construct a rational narrative. More detailed accounts come from the other members of the party, whose testimony was collected over the following weeks. Henry Patterson's statement, recorded on May 20, 1879, describes the approach to the excavation site. As we drew near to the mound, we all remarked upon an unpleasant odor in the air, similar to decaying organic matter, but with an underlying scent I cannot adequately describe. The entrance to the excavation yawned before us like a wound in the earth. Deputy Wade called into the tunnel, but received no answer. After some discussion, he and I agreed to enter with lanterns while Mr. Blackwood remained outside. Patterson's account of what he witnessed inside the mound is where testimony begins to diverge significantly from what might be expected in a conventional investigation. He stated, "The tunnel extended approximately 15 feet into the mound before opening into a large chamber. The chamber was roughly circular and appeared to have been carefully constructed by the ancient builders of the mound. But what arrested our attention immediately were the remains. Seated around the perimeter of the chamber were what appeared to be mummified or naturally preserved bodies, 17 in number, positioned as if engaged in some eternal council. The preservation was remarkable, with skin and tissue still adhering to the skeletal frames. More troubling was Patterson's description of what surrounded these remains. Scattered throughout the chamber were personal effects that clearly belonged to the Heidecker family. We found a coat belonging to Emil Heidecker, a child's doll that Reverend Thornhill later identified as belonging to young Clara, and numerous tools and surveying equipment. But no members of the family were present in the chamber. What we did find, and what I am at a loss to explain, were marks on the earthen floor, as if something large and heavy had been dragged from the chamber toward a section of the back wall where the earth appeared freshly disturbed. Deputy Marshal Wade ordered the search expanded. Over the following 3 days, more than 20 men, including both white settlers and Choctaw volunteers, combed the area around the mounds, searching for any sign of the Heidecker family. The search revealed several disturbing findings. Approximately 100 yards from the main mound, searchers discovered the body of Wilhelm Heidecker, the 11-year-old boy. Dr. Samuel Anderson, who traveled from Fort Smith to examine the remains, reported that the boy appeared to have died from exposure and dehydration. However, Anderson noted peculiar details in his medical report dated May 19, 1879. The deceased shows signs of having spent considerable time exposed to the elements prior to death, despite the fact that the weather during the past 2 weeks has been mild. More perplexing is the condition of the fingernails, which are broken and embedded with soil, suggesting the child engaged in desperate digging or scratching at the earth. The expression preserved on the face is one of extreme terror. No trace of Emil Heidecker, Margaret, Friedrich, Anna, or Clara was found during the initial search. The only other physical evidence discovered was a journal identified as belonging to Emil Heidecker, found partially buried near the entrance to the excavation. The journal's final entries would provide the most disturbing element of the entire case. The journal was turned over to territorial authorities, and its contents were initially kept confidential due to their disturbing nature. However, portions of the journal were eventually transcribed and circulated among researchers attempting to understand the events at Spiro. The final dated entry is from May 8, 1879, 3 days before the search party's arrival. The handwriting in these late entries is notably degraded compared to the careful script of earlier pages, becoming increasingly erratic and difficult to decipher. The entry reads, "They are not dead, as I believed." The preservation of the remains is not the result of natural mummification or the particular chemistry of the soil. They are in a state between life and death, a suspension that I lack the terminology to describe accurately. When I removed the tablets from the chamber, I initiated a process. The inscriptions are not merely historical records. They are instructions, or perhaps warnings. The translation I have managed suggests a ritual of descent, a methodology for accessing chambers that lie beneath this chamber, descending to depths that defy the physical dimensions of the mound. The entry continues, "I have made a terrible error. Friedrich understands this now, though his knowledge came too late. He has seen what lies below, and the sight has transformed him. He speaks of cities beneath the earth, vast spaces that exist in directions our geometry does not account for. Margaret begs me to cease, but I cannot. The compulsion to understand, to see what the ancient builders saw, has become overwhelming. Tonight, we will attempt to follow the path described in the tablets. The children must come. The ritual requires the presence of youth, the unblemished, to open the way." There, the journal entries end. The pages that follow are blank, except for a series of drawings or diagrams that investigators have been unable to interpret. They appear to represent architectural or geometric forms, but rendered in a manner that creates visual confusion, with angles and perspectives that seem to shift depending on how the page is viewed. The investigation into the disappearance of the Heidecker family continued throughout the summer of 1879. Territorial authorities offered rewards for information, and search parties periodically returned to the site to look for additional evidence. In June, officials ordered the excavation tunnel sealed, and the artifacts that had been removed from the burial chamber were collected and sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., for study. Records from the Smithsonian indicate that the items arrived in late July, but curiously, no documentation exists of their subsequent analysis or current location. Inquiries made by researchers in later decades determined that the items had either been lost, destroyed, or remain in storage under a classification that restricts access. During the autumn of 1879, several peculiar incidents were reported by families living near the Spiro mounds. Elizabeth Fairchild, wife of a settler who had established a farm 2 miles west of the site, reported to authorities that her 8-year-old daughter claimed to have seen a girl in old-fashioned clothes near the riverbank. The description the child provided matched that of Anna Heidecker. When a search party investigated, they found no trace of anyone in the area, though they did note unusual depressions in the earth near where the sighting was reported. More disturbing was an incident in October involving a Choctaw hunting party. 3 men tracking deer in the forests south of the mounds reported encountering a man they believed to be Emil Heidecker. Their account, provided to tribal authorities and later shared with territorial officials, stated that the man appeared to be in a dazed state, his clothes in tatters, his appearance wild and unkempt. When they attempted to approach him, he fled into the dense forest with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for a man of Heidecker's age and presumed condition. Despite an immediate search, no trace of him was found. As winter approached, the reports and sightings diminished. The small settlement that had been forming in the area began to disperse. Joseph Blackwood closed his trading post in Scullyville in November 1879, citing poor business conditions, but privately telling associates that he could not remain in a region marked by such dark events. Several Choctaw families relocated to other parts of the territory. By early 1880, the land around the Spiro Mounds had returned to wilderness, avoided by those who knew its recent history. The case might have faded entirely from public awareness had it not been for a secondary investigation conducted in 1897 by Professor Martin Everett Chambers, an anthropologist from Harvard University. Chambers, who was conducting a broader survey of indigenous burial sites in Indian Territory, became aware of the Heidecker incident through references in territorial records. His interest piqued. Chambers spent 3 months in the region during the summer of 1897, interviewing those who remembered the events of 1879 and attempting to locate the Heidecker excavation site. Chambers' findings, published in a somewhat obscure academic journal titled American Antiquarian Studies Quarterly in 1899, provide valuable secondary documentation of the case. He was able to locate and interview Samuel Whitfield, still living in the area, as well as Henry Patterson and the Reverend Marcus Thornhill. Chambers also made a significant discovery that had been overlooked by earlier investigators. In the cabin that had belonged to the Heidecker family, now collapsed and overgrown, Chambers found additional papers hidden beneath floorboards. These included letters written by Margaret Heidecker to her sister in Pennsylvania, letters that had apparently never been sent. One of these letters, dated April 30th, 1879, contains passages that Chambers found so disturbing that he initially declined to publish them. The letter eventually appeared in a footnote in his 1899 article, though the full text was not made public until decades later. Margaret wrote, "My dearest sister, I fear we will not leave this place alive. Emil has become obsessed beyond reason. He speaks of the ancient people who built these mounds as if he knows them personally, as if he has conversed with them. The tablets he brought from the burial chamber seem to exert an influence over him. He sits for hours tracing the symbols, muttering in a language I do not recognize. Most terrible of all, the children are changing. Friedrich has his father's eyes now, but they are not his father's eyes. They are older eyes, eyes that have seen things no 16-year-old should see. Anna refuses to eat. She says the food is wrong, that it comes from the upper world, and she no longer belongs to the upper world. Little Wilhelm cries in the night, and when I go to him, he speaks of people standing around his bed, people with copper ornaments and faces painted in ways that terrify him. Only Clara seems untouched. But for how much longer? Professor Chambers also documented something that earlier investigators had not fully appreciated. The Spiro site was not unique in the region's history of disturbing events. Through interviews with elderly Choctaw residents, Chambers learned of oral traditions concerning the mounds that predated even the Choctaw arrival in the territory. These traditions, passed down through generations, spoke of the site as a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin, where ancient peoples had conducted rituals designed to communicate with or perhaps traverse into other realms of existence. One Choctaw elder, identified in Chambers' notes only as Thomas, provided an account that suggests the indigenous peoples who lived in the region before the arrival of Europeans had their own troubling experiences with the mounds. Thomas stated, "The old stories, from before the white men came, tell of a people who built the mounds as doorways, not doorways between places in this world, but doorways to places beneath and beyond. They say those people disappeared, not all at once, but slowly over many years. They would go into the great mound for their ceremonies, and fewer would come out, until finally none came out at all, and the mound stood empty for hundreds of years, until the Choctaw came to this land and knew enough to leave them undisturbed." Professor Chambers attempted to excavate the site himself in August of 1897, but found the work proceeding with extraordinary difficulty. Several members of his team reported feeling overwhelming anxiety and disorientation when working near the mounds. One assistant, a graduate student named Robert Kinsey, suffered what was described as a complete nervous collapse after spending several hours inside the burial chamber. Kinsey was transported to Fort Smith and eventually to a hospital in Little Rock, where he remained for 3 months before recovering sufficiently to return east. In correspondence with Chambers, Kinsey later wrote that he had experienced vivid hallucinations while in the chamber, seeing the preserved remains moving and turning their heads to watch him, though he acknowledged these experiences must have been products of psychological distress rather than objective reality. Chambers eventually abandoned his excavation after less than 2 weeks of work. In his published article, he attributed this decision to logistical difficulties and the opposition of local residents. However, his private journals, not available to scholars until after his death in 1924, reveal a more complex motivation. He wrote, "I have become convinced that there are phenomena associated with this site that lie outside the framework of conventional archaeological inquiry. Whether these phenomena are purely psychological in nature, products of suggestion and the documented tragedies that occurred here, or whether they point to aspects of ancient practices that we do not fully understand, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that I find myself unable to continue work at the site without experiencing profound distress." The Spiro mounds would not be excavated again in any systematic way until the 1930s, when commercial treasure hunters formed the Pocola Mining Company and conducted a devastating looting operation that destroyed much of the site's archaeological integrity. These commercial diggers encountered none of the unusual phenomena reported by Chambers or the earlier investigators, though this may simply reflect their exclusive focus on recovering saleable artifacts rather than careful archaeological documentation. Ironically, their destructive activities provided the material that eventually allowed archaeologists to understand the true nature of the Spiro site, a major ceremonial center of the Mississippian culture, one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. But the question remains, what happened to the Heidecker family? In the decades following the initial disappearance, sporadic reports continued to surface. In 1903, a farmer plowing fields 5 miles from the mounds unearthed human remains that were initially believed to be quite ancient. However, forensic examination suggested a more recent date of death, perhaps 20 to 30 years prior. The remains were of an adult male, and the positioning of the body suggested burial rather than natural death and deposition. Some investigators theorized this might be Emil Heidecker, but positive identification was impossible with the forensic methods available at that time. In 1912, a woman living in Poteau, the county seat of Flore County, reported to authorities that a woman had approached her claiming to be Clara Heidecker. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 40s, consistent with Clara's age if she had survived, was severely disoriented and unable to provide coherent information about her identity or whereabouts for the previous 33 years. She was taken to a hospital in Fort Smith, where she remained for 2 weeks before escaping one night. No record exists of her ever being found. The hospital staff reported that she had been obsessed with digging, repeatedly attempting to excavate the floor of her room with her bare hands, saying she needed to go back down to where they were waiting for her. The most compelling subsequent report came in 1928, nearly 50 years after the initial disappearance. A construction crew working on a road project approximately 10 miles from the Spiro Mounds discovered a small chamber approximately 8 feet below ground level. The chamber appeared to be artificial, carefully excavated and reinforced with timbers. Inside were the remains of 2 individuals, one adult and one child or adolescent. Next to the remains was a leather bag containing several of the inscribed tablets that had been described in Emil Heidecker's journal. The tablets were confiscated by state authorities and, like the earlier artifacts sent to the Smithsonian, seemed to have disappeared from the documentary record. Dr. William Thornton, a physician from Poteau who examined the remains found in 1928, provided a statement to the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was only discovered in archived files in 1967. Dr. Thornton wrote, "The remains showed evidence of having been interred for a considerable period, consistent with 40 to 50 years. However, the state of preservation was unusual. Tissue and skin remained adhered to the bones in patterns suggesting either deliberate mummification or preservation by natural means that I cannot explain. More disturbing was the positioning of the remains. They were arranged in seated postures, facing each other, with their hands positioned as if holding or presenting objects that were no longer present. The expression on the skull of the adult figure, preserved by the remaining tissue, suggested not peaceful death, but rather something closer to ecstasy or revelation. The question of what Emil Heidecker discovered in the Spiro burial chamber, what the inscribed tablets contained, and what ultimately happened to the family, has been the subject of speculation and investigation by archaeologists, historians, and others for well over a century. Various theories have been proposed ranging from the rational to the speculative. The most conservative interpretation suggests that Emil Heidecker working in isolation and without proper academic support, became psychologically unbalanced by his discoveries and the isolated conditions of his life. This interpretation holds that he may have developed delusional beliefs about the significance of the artifacts he discovered, beliefs that were communicated to his family and which contributed to a shared psychological crisis. Under this theory, the family either perished in the wilderness after fleeing in a state of mental distress, or they deliberately concealed themselves to avoid what they perceived as persecution, or to continue pursuing Heidecker's obsessive research. Other investigators have focused on the physical evidence, the unusual preservation of remains found at the site, the reports of anomalous phenomena, and the consistent pattern of psychological distress experienced by those who work extensively at the site. These researchers have proposed that the Mississippian builders of the Spiro mounds may have incorporated substances or materials into the construction that produce hallucinogenic or psychoactive effects when disturbed. Certain molds, fungi, or mineral compounds, when released into the air of enclosed spaces, could theoretically produce the vivid hallucinations and psychological disturbances reported by Heidecker and subsequent investigators. A third category of interpretation, generally dismissed by mainstream academics but persistent in fringe archaeological circles, takes more seriously the accounts provided by indigenous sources. These interpretations suggest that the Mississippian culture at Spiro had developed ceremonial practices involving altered states of consciousness, practices designed to access or communicate with realms of existence beyond conventional physical reality. Proponents of this view point to the elaborate cosmology of Mississippian culture, documented through artifacts and later indigenous accounts, which conceived of the universe as consisting of multiple layered worlds, with passageways between them accessible through ritual knowledge. What remains undeniable is that the Spiro site has been associated with unusually consistent reports of disturbing phenomena across different time periods and cultural contexts. The Choctaw traditions collected by Professor Chambers in the 1890s, the experiences of the Heidecker family in 1879, the difficulties encountered by Chambers' own expedition in 1897, and scattered reports from subsequent decades all describe similar patterns. Psychological disorientation, vivid dreams or visions, the sense of presences or entities associated with the site, and compulsive behaviors focused on descending or digging downward. In 1978, the Spiro Mounds Archaeological State Park was established, and the site is now managed by the Oklahoma Historical Society. The park includes an interpretive center and allows limited public access to portions of the mound complex. Rangers and staff at the park have occasionally reported unusual experiences, though these are generally attributed to the power of suggestion and the site's documented history of tragedy. One former park ranger, speaking anonymously to a journalist in 1995, stated, "There are times, usually in the early morning or just after sunset, when you can stand near the main mound and feel that you're being observed, not by anything you can see, but by something aware of your presence." The scientific part of my mind says this is just psychology, the effect of knowing what happened here. But there's another part of my mind that wonders if the Choctaw elders who warned against disturbing the site knew something we've forgotten. The artifacts recovered from Spiro during the commercial looting of the 1930s are now scattered across more than 200 museums and countless private collections worldwide. These objects, including carved shell gorgets, copper plates, ceramic vessels, and stone effigies, represent some of the finest examples of Mississippian art known to exist. They demonstrate a sophisticated artistic tradition and complex ceremonial life. But the inscribed tablets that Emil Heidecker described in his journal, the objects that seem to exert such a powerful influence over him, have never been positively identified in any collection. Whether they were destroyed, remain in storage under restricted classification, or were never recovered from wherever Heidecker and his family ultimately ended, their journey remains unknown. Academic interest in the Heidecker case has been sporadic. Most archaeologists and historians who study the Mississippian period focus on the physical evidence, the artifacts, the architecture of the mounds, the trade networks, and social organization they reveal. The disappearance of one settler family in 1879, while tragic, is often viewed as tangential to understanding the broader cultural patterns. However, a small number of researchers have continued to investigate the case, motivated by the consistency and detail of the documentary evidence. Dr. Sarah Morrison, an anthropologist at the University of Oklahoma, who has specialized in Mississippian ceremonial practices, published an analysis of the Heidecker case in 2003. Morrison argued that the inscribed tablets Heidecker described may have been genuine ceremonial objects containing symbolic or representational information about Mississippian cosmology and ritual practice. She suggested that Heidecker, lacking the cultural context to properly interpret these symbols, may have constructed an interpretation that reflected European occult traditions with which he was familiar through his education, rather than the actual meaning of the symbols. This misinterpretation, combined with the psychological stress of isolation and the disturbing nature of working in a burial chamber, could have led to the delusional beliefs documented in his journal. Morrison's analysis is compelling, but leaves significant questions unanswered. It does not fully account for the physical evidence, the unusual preservation of remains discovered in 1928, the consistent reports of phenomena from multiple witnesses who had no prior knowledge of Heidecker's experiences, or the curious disappearance of artifacts sent to major institutions for study. Neither does it explain the reports of sightings of Heidecker family members years after their disappearance. In 2011, a documentary film crew working on a project about Oklahoma mysteries attempted to investigate the Heidecker case. They conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys around the Spiro mounds, looking for evidence of chambers or cavities that might extend deeper than the known structures. The surveys did identify several anomalies in the subsurface geology, including what appear to be voids or chambers at depths of 20 to 30 feet, far below the base of the mounds themselves. However, excavation to investigate these anomalies has not been permitted by the Oklahoma Historical Society, which cites concerns about damaging the integrity of the archaeological site. The documentary crew also interviewed descendants of families who lived in Flore County in 1879. Several of these interviews revealed family stories and traditions about the Heidecker case that had not been previously documented. One descendant of Samuel Whitfield stated that his great-grandfather had told stories about seeing lights and hearing sounds from the mounds that continued for years after the disappearance. Another interviewee, a descendant of a Choctaw family from the region, shared a story passed down through generations about the white family who opened the door and could not close it again. What can be stated with certainty is this. In the spring and summer of 1879, a family consisting of 6 people disappeared from a remote settlement in Flore County, Indian Territory. One child, 11-year-old Wilhelm Heidecker, was found dead under circumstances suggesting terror and desperate flight. The other 5 members of the family were never definitively located, though sporadic reports of sightings continued for decades. The disappearance was associated with the excavation of a Mississippian period burial mound that had been constructed between 500 and 700 years earlier. Documentary evidence in the form of journals, letters, and testimony from multiple witnesses describes unusual psychological phenomena associated with the excavation and with the site more broadly. The case of the Heidecker family raises profound questions about the limits of archaeological investigation, the respect due to ancient burial sites, and the ways in which different cultures conceptualize the relationship between the living and the dead. The Choctaw people who warned Emil Heidecker against disturbing the mounds possessed knowledge passed down through oral tradition, knowledge that recognized the site as dangerous or liminal in some fundamental way. Heidecker, operating within the framework of 19th century scientific rationalism, dismissed these warnings as superstition. The consequences of that dismissal were catastrophic for his family and contributed to the aura of dread that has surrounded the Spiro mounds ever since. To this day, the area around the Spiro mounds remains sparsely populated. The town of Spiro, established in 1895, lies approximately 7 miles from the mound complex and has never grown beyond a population of a few thousand. Local residents generally avoid the mounds after dark, not from any explicit fear, but from what they describe as a feeling of unease or inappropriateness about visiting the site at night. Park staff have reported finding evidence that individuals or small groups occasionally conduct unauthorized visits to the site during nighttime hours, leaving behind burned candles, offerings of tobacco or other materials, and occasionally symbols drawn or scratched into the earth near the main mound. Whether these visitors are seeking spiritual experiences, attempting to replicate Heidecker's work, or simply drawn by the dark history of the site, is unknown. What is known is that the Spiro mounds continue to exert a powerful hold on the imagination of those who learn their history. The mounds stand as monuments to a sophisticated culture that flourished and then vanished, leaving behind questions that modern archaeology continues to explore. They also stand as a memorial to the Heidecker family, whose fate remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in the history of the American frontier. The question of what Emil Heidecker found in that burial chamber, what the inscribed tablets truly contained, and what happened to him and his family in the days after his final journal entry may never be definitively answered. The evidence that might provide those answers disappeared along with the family, scattered across the landscape of southeastern Oklahoma, buried in the archives of institutions that may not even be aware of what they possess, or perhaps descending into depths that contemporary archaeology has neither the tools nor perhaps the wisdom to explore. What remains is the story itself, preserved in fragments of documentation, in testimony recorded decades after the events, in oral traditions passed down through generations, and in the persistent sense among those who visit the site that the Spiro mounds contain secrets that transcend the purely archaeological. The story serves as a reminder of the limits of human knowledge, the dangers of certainty in the face of the genuinely unknown, and the perhaps unbridgeable gap between scientific understanding and the older ways of knowing that recognized certain places, certain thresholds, as best left undisturbed. The inscription that appeared on a small marker placed near the Heidecker property in 1925, erected by persons unknown, reads simply, "Here dwelt the Heidecker family, 1878 to 1829. They sought knowledge in places where knowledge should not be sought. May they find peace in whatever depths they have descended." The marker disappeared during the 1930s, likely destroyed or removed during the commercial looting of the site. But photographs of it exist in various archives, and the words it bore continue to serve as an epitaph for a family who encountered something in the darkness beneath that ancient mound, something that 5 members of the Heidecker family found simultaneously compelling and catastrophic. As we conclude this journey through one of the most disturbing documented cases in Oklahoma history, we are left with the essential question that haunts all such investigations. What truly lies beneath the surface of the earth in places marked by centuries of ceremony and tradition? Are the warnings of indigenous peoples simply products of superstition, or do they preserve genuine wisdom about the dangers inherent in disturbing certain sites? The Heidecker family learned the answer to these questions, though, at a cost that most would find unthinkable. Their story endures as a warning, an enigma, and a testament to the profound mysteries that remain buried in the ancient places of this continent.